Okay. Hi everyone, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to this year's UNITE SDG Summit. My name is Augusta Senenssie. I am really delighted to be delivering a keynote address this year. And yeah, it's really cool to be able to come back. As you know, if you know, which you might not know because most of you, this might be your first time attending, this is actually not my first year at the Youth SDG Summit. I actually came here, UNITE SDG Summit, sorry. I actually came here and spoke last autumn, and I delivered the address that you're about to watch today. And ironically, at the time, I was in Puglia in Italy. I was in a really remote town, typing up my field research notes at the time. I contracted coronavirus, and partway through delivering the address, which was a bit of a load of technical errors, I realized I had coronavirus. And so I wanted the contents of this address to be shared and for people to be able to look at this and access it, because I think that this information is pretty timely, and on the eve of COP26, I think it's more pressing than ever. So I'm really lucky that I was able to re-record it for you guys today, and you'll either be watching or accessing this via the Unite Summit platform, web platform, or you'll also be watching this via my YouTube channel, where I just upload addresses and interviews that I do. If you have any questions, I'm sure that at the end of it, I will redirect you to all of my social media channels where you can kind of keep up to date with anything that I'm up to, although I'm not very good at sharing things broadly. And I have a few questions that were set aside for me. They are answered in part last year, but also some additional ones about kind of breaking into the industry. And I'll talk you through all of that. So yeah, so if you do see any statistics, data, research that's outdated, that is probably why. It's because most of this is from my content from 2020. I didn't really want to change much of it because I thought that it was still pretty relevant. So yeah, hopefully that will be for an interesting session. And yeah, I hope you're ready for an hour and a half of me talking at you. So yes, so what I'm going to do first and foremost is actually share my screen with you all. If you just give me 2 seconds, I'm going to quickly actually find the right screen to share with you all. SDG Summit, I'm really delighted that you guys are here today. As you'll notice, the title of this says 2020 because I am re-recording my keynote address from last year. Essentially what happened was I had started presenting to you guys when I was struck by coronavirus. And so the presentation did continue to a lovely audience of 250 people. But we wanted to be able to have somewhere for you guys to be redirected to rewatch the conference if you had any questions, and to just be able to reference a lot of the topics that I talk about here, which is I try to make as accessible as possible, but it does indubitably fall down slightly academic, jargonistic lines. I know jargonistic is not a word, but we're using it for this conference. So yeah, so hopefully this is going to be really helpful and interesting to you all. I have tried to bear in mind the fact that we have got varying audiences of different levels of expertise. But yeah, I'm excited to talk. Hopefully you enjoy it. My name is Augusta. I will probably introduce myself again in very shortly. But before I do that, I wanted to actually share with you a video that I constructed last year, which is very cringy to watch, but it's very useful in giving and providing some context to the types of topics that we'll be talking about over the course of the next hour and a half.
Good evening. The struggle against COVID is the single biggest crisis the world has faced in my lifetime.
Wait, what was that?
Single biggest crisis the world has faced in my lifetime.
Okay, we have a problem.
2019, Australia was hit by the most devastating bushfire season the country has ever seen. By mid-January, an estimated 10 million hectares had been incinerated, an area larger than the 2019 California fires and Amazon fires combined.
They're scared. That's why we're getting no reaction here. There's a doctor from the medical charity Médecins Sans Frontières on.
Take a minute to think about this. There are approximately 40.3 million men, women and children living in the world who are victims of modern slavery. It is incomprehensible that any slavery exists today.
list of around 40 Belarusian officials who it blames for abuses of power against ongoing anti-government protest, as well as electoral fraud in last month's disputed elections.
Dozens of people have lost their lives, thousands of homes have been destroyed, and estimates suggest that more than 1 billion animals have been killed.
Knowledge of people looking at our planet, Mother Earth, there's something drastically happening. You know, the climate change, the extreme weather, you know, the bushfires, the drought, all that thing's happening. So people are seeing it. Yeah. You know, not just us, but non-Indigenous people as well, and they're starting to wake up. Yeah. Because we all need Mother Nature.
The pandemic isn't the greatest crisis the world has faced, but we are living in one of the most dangerous times in human history. With so much devastation, uproar, and change, it's time for legislatures and world leaders to stop thinking about things through their own myopic lens and start to act differently. What if this time at home has forced us to reflect and to realise that our lives aren't too different, that we're not just a human race, we're global citizens?
There we go to the next slide. There we go. Crack the code, guys. So I hope that video provided a really helpful overview and that you didn't find my attempts at editing too cringy. But yeah, I think when I recorded, at the time of recording this last year, we had entered an era that my friends and I have kind of jokingly dubbed, but not very jokingly, political depression. And it's basically where the sheer volume of negative political news and the constant underlying expectation that we as citizens, global people, as young people, need to constantly be engaged, have opinions, have visceral responses to the things that we're seeing on the news can become so overwhelming that can actually make us feel very low and sad because we can't really fix those challenges today. And I hope that for those of you watching this panel, you would have noticed that I'm not going to be able to provide like a silver bullet, a one solution answer to a lot of the issues that I'll be raising today. But I think that the very fact that you're sitting and engaging in a summit like this, learning about policy issues, trying to engage in discussions, interactive sessions and workshops is just one of the things that I did growing up that I think really has helped me forge a career in international policy and research, and has actually allowed me to be able to present at a summit like this. So hopefully that gives you guys a bit more courage and some good faith. When I recorded this summit, I was actually 22 years old. And as you'll notice, a lot of the things that I've done globally happened within the ages of 21 to 22. I'm now 23, turning 24 in December, which is absolutely insane to say. And we've kind of gone full circle. But when I started off in policy and in activism, I was about the age of 11 years old when my face was on my local town's news gazette, peering into a cabinet minister's fed box. And growing up, I really wanted to have a main kind of stay, an opinion, a deciding factor in stakeholder engagement in global policy and discussions. And so obviously when I was 13, I wasn't doing high level policy discussions or consultations. I've done bits and pieces of those at 23, but I mean, that is few and far between. And I know that there's probably a lot more work that I need to do before I'm eligible to be sitting in those sort of conversations. But I have slowly started to build an international international policy and consulting career that has really led me to be able to develop a really amazing portfolio of discussions and conversations and interviews that you can see in the images saved below. I say this because I think it's really important, but I wouldn't have been able to do any of this had it not been for the most kind of pivotal moment in my policy career. And that was when I was age 19. And it feels so surreal to look at these photos of myself. At this age, obviously, I was sporting a lovely African tan with lovely curly hair, and I was rocking the hipster chic look. And this was after these photos were taken, I think, predominantly at the tail end of a 3-month research placement that I did in a small village in Kabwe. It's a province in Zambia called Mwawa, and I was there for 3 months. I love saying Mwawa, it's a great name, Mwawa. But I actually didn't end up going there purely on a research assignment. I actually went as part of ICS, which I don't know if it's still running. I think it's been disrupted by COVID-19, but it was the International Citizenship Service. And initially I was going to volunteer with Restless Development until I realized that I was, one, not qualified to be a development worker or aid worker. Two, the program was tired and dated. And three, I didn't really believe in the ethos and methodology of the organization. And so instead, in my typical Gen Z rambunctiousness, decided that I was going to try and research and understand as much about rural livelihoods, communities, and observe any major issues and challenges that communities were facing, and collaborate with different stakeholders and partners to create a development program. I wouldn't even call it a development program, I'd just call it an action plan that would help these community work on real life issues. And I actually have a piece that I wrote about it when I was about 20, 21. I put it on my LinkedIn. So what I will do is I'm going to put up the old copy of that article onto my Medium alongside any other articles or research that I reference here. And I will redirect you to any channels at the end of this talk so that you can look at them. And it was really great. It transformed my objectives and at the time, I was in my first year of law, and I ended up deciding to interrupt, and I never went back to law, which is a story for another time. And I ended up focusing on policy and trying to understand what was going on in the world, because I realized at that up until age 19, I was pretty ignorant of global issues in that were not Western or European American centric. And so that was something that really transformed the kind of trajectory and my priorities in my coming years. And it's led me now to be 23 and to be able to talk to you guys. So it was really great. And I just love looking at these pictures because this was a turning point in my kind of global policy and research career. It also, very excitingly, has culminated in the founding of my own ethnographic research consultancy firm, Walinda Lingo, which is Swahili for gatekeepers. And it actually came about because about 2 years ago, I'd just come back from a research fellowship at the University of Sydney, more on that later. And I was so tired of sitting in consultations in varying capacities and degrees. And not really having like a decisive role or say in kind of the trajectory or the future of communities and groups beyond sort of like lip service and blah, there should be things to change. By the way, I do blur a lot, so but if you're confused in the audience, it's not a special part of the English vernacular, it's just me being weird. But yes, I was tired of talking with policymakers a lot about, often with information that they'd only really heard for the first time, having them kind of say, we're going to make X, Y, and Z changes, and then looking at kind of policy objectives a minute after consultations where they pretty much don't implement a single thing. And it meant that I just kind of really wanted to do something different. And so in November of that year, I ended up going to a Global Landscapes Forum Summit. You can see my interview and a bit of my panel discussions and contributions on my Instagram. on my YouTube. So many social media channels. And it actually ended up culminating in me being offered some five figures worth of investment to launch my own consultancy firm, which at the time was going by its English name, Gatekeepers. I had little to no idea about how it was going to evolve, and it has taken 2 and a bit years of really trying to understand it. We went to Ghana earlier this year to test our research methodology, to see how the partnerships would work and how to conduct our studies. And now we'll be launching in spring 2022, not winter 2021. And we actually did in 2020 return the investment and now it is fully self-funded and self-financed, which is very exciting. Nerve-wracking at 21 to be making that kind of sort of concession, but I'm really excited now, age 23, almost 24, to see what a completely self-funded consultancy firm will look like. Yes, so now on to the main part of the conversation of this session, which is talking and understanding about Indigenous and displaced research. So what I thought we could do is just kind of go over a few objectives, so it should hopefully make it a bit easier for you guys to understand what you should expect in the course of, I guess, now the next hour. Well, the first thing that I hope that this address will be able to achieve is to present examples, learnings, understandings of key concepts around words like indigeneity, disparateness, displacement, and sustainable peace, which is not in quotation marks because it seemed like the only word that didn't have a contentious ideological definition, which it definitely does. Understand the benefits that come from more disruptive research collation and methodologies. So as you'll notice over the course of this panel discussion and keynote address, I will definitely be talking about non-traditional research methods, and I will be signposting just some of my research papers that will be coming out later on this year that kind of go into those topics in much more detail. And I hope that it will contextualize, it says contextualize the abstract there, by providing an overview of statistics, interesting research, and field case studies that would be really helpful for anyone trying to understand these concepts in particular depth. Hopefully it can give you something to look into after the discussion or to ask questions about at the end. And one thing that I always try to do in every really slightly depressing keynote address or evidence sharing session that I tend to partake in, I always try to look to a future, reimagining based on all of the information that's presented to you, what a change in policy directions or in futures would look like. And so what I'll be doing at the tail end of this presentation is sharing how I envisage a reimagined environmental policy or consultation process within Australia, using my time as a research fellow at the University of Sydney as the blueprint. At the end of the session, excitingly for us all, I hope I will be also having a Q&A session for about 15 to 20 minutes, and I will answer any questions that you guys have about being a young person in international policy, any questions about your careers, pathways, and anything else that you want to know from me will kind of be addressed in the course of that session. And of course, I will signpost to you all. I do not have any links to my social media channels. Bad Zoomer indeed. But I will help you and redirect you to anything that you want to know about me, any places that you want to ask any questions. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. And just to give you kind of tips about the future that I wish that I had when I was a young person working in finance. It'll also be useful for any of the policymakers and researchers in the audience that want to maybe ask me any particular questions about my research or collaborate on any future projects, to be able to talk to me and have a way to directly reach out to me. And so yes, without further ado, I'm excited to finally start the presentation. So the first thing I wanted to do was frame a key concept and buzzword that I will mention time and time again in the course of the next now, I guess maybe 50 minutes, which is all about disparate communities. Now, I think that it's undeniable, unquestionable that the buzzwords of this presentation are definitely Indigenous, marginalised, displaced, and disparate. But I'm pretty sure that for some of you guys in this audience, this might be the first time you've heard of these words or you've seen these words used in this particular context. So I'm not surprised if I hear some of you turning to your peers saying, what does she mean? How can we frame our understanding of the challenges that these communities are facing when it's so difficult to know who and what we're talking about when we use such broad terms? And ironically, that's actually one of the challenges with our approach to disparateness within global research. Now, by its very definition, disparate is a concept that is kind of intangible. It's meant to be really difficult to compare or liken to anything else. So you can't liken disparate to night or day, black or white, although ironically it is used to kind of juxtapose different things. So for example, night or day, hot or cold, black or white. So it's a really weird word that's used, but it is constantly referenced. And if you look at any report, any literature that normally talks about displacement or rural communities or indigeneity, disparate will undoubtedly come up. I've made a new word there, undoubtedly come up. And it's something that I think we need to understand a bit more of if we're going to talk about how we can change our approach to disparate research. Now, I do think that disparate is an important word. Like I've said to you, it can be used to parallel between experiences. So here I've given the case study of the example of a rural farming community with corporate city dwellers. But even within provinces, cities or nations, the experiences within communities of people that belong to the same group can be markedly just different, can be disparate. But in what I've noticed in my observations as a consultant and as a researcher, traditionally, we tend to approach disparate communities as being isolated groups and not kind of cohesive communities in the way that we approach our research and our interaction and engagement with them. And I actually would argue that this kind of remoteness, this idea of like isolating different groups, and when we're creating disparate comparisons or disparate research priorities and strategies, is actually exactly where we've been going wrong. So to exemplify this point, I have two beautiful images here of two very different but quite similar women. So here we have Sonali, and she's a Sri Lankan rice farmer. And here we have Mary, who is a Sudanese refugee woman in a refugee camp in Kigali. Now, on the face of it, these women could be no different, right? Couldn't be more different, sorry. Sonali is based in South Asia. She works in a different terrain. She is working in a farm, and Mary is a displaced woman. Yet when you learn a bit more about these women's stories, there are loads of things that they have in common. They both work or are from rural communities. They have quite large families and are widowed and have to deal with trying to create economic opportunities for their children in communities that are poorly sanitized, with limited access to free education or healthcare. These women also deal with the major kind of challenge of living in a patriarchal society and are illiterate, and so do not have traditional pathways out of poverty alleviation. So on the face of it, in our approach to research, we might kind of segment these women and focus maybe on a Southeastern strategy and an African strategy and how we kind of tackle the challenges that they're facing. Yet, I actually think that there's a lot more commonalities that can be derived from looking at these women as case studies that are kind of holistic, but it has to be done in the right way. Now, I know that some of you in the audience might be shuddering in dismay at my suggestion that we kind of group together people based on external kind of commonalities. And it's something that I definitely do find really frustrating about our approach to development or aid. It's often through the lens that communities and groups can be kind of understood as a homogenous identity and subset, and therefore our policies need to be kind of enacted as such. But I think there is a nuance in how we approach kind of creating togetherness in our research policies and strategies. And so here, to exemplify this point, I'm just sharing a still from a post that I put on my Instagram in April 2020. And I'll just read it to you quickly, and then we can kind of delve into what I mean by this. So in the midst of global conversations around self-isolation and government subsidies, my mind turns to rural farmers, the case study of both women. Remote oceanic communities, East African tribes, and Southern African farming groups are all united by a common enemy: insecurity. Insecurity around crop yield as soil and temperatures change, insecurity providing for their large families, successfully competing against commercial farms, eclipsing local markets. COVID-19 has exacerbated these tensions as markets close and people retreat inside. With over 60% of Africans alone relying on small-scale farming, support for these communities has never been more important. Whilst the International Fund for Agricultural Development International Development's pledge of $200 million to keep rural farms operational, and governments have mandated trade with smaller scale farmers and government mandated trades with small scale farmers is commendable, I still think we can do more. Let's tackle knowledge deficits within rural communities. There should always be funding for small scale farmers who help mitigate potential food shortages when borders close and importing is no longer an option. As the world increases in uncertainty, their voices will become more valuable. So why not start listening now? And I think this is where I argue that disparateness, treating groups of people that have very similar realities as separate, can be a massive failure. Our strategies need to kind of understand that the challenges that face communities and groups of people are universal. And so trying to strike a balance between these two ideas, looking at maybe broader macro themes, whilst also recognizing the micro realities of communities, I think is a better way of creating a more unified structure. And we do see things like the Sustainable Development Goals being really helpful, but we've also noticed that there's still an issue with siloing, so segmenting people or treating goals as singular. And so when I argue for a disruptive approach to disparate research, it's not simply about the case studies that we use, but it's also about the approaches and the way that we tackle international kind of policy agendas and bills. But disparateness is a concept that kind of marries on quite well with the next concept, which is marginalization. And so we enter into a new side of the segment of the presentation, which I've quite wittingly called marginalized existence, marginalized people. Now, I think marginalization is a concept that is both overarching in scope, but could also be understood through a macro and micro lens. So, I mean, you can look at marginalization as being global and local, as marginalization between peoples and nations, and policy and political orders. Now here I have an updated chart. This is from the United Nations Human Rights Council's mid-year report that was issued in 2020. And what it did actually was look at COVID migrant precariousness and look at the ways in which things had been exacerbated throughout the time of the pandemic. So what I wanted to do here was just read you an excerpt from a report that I sourced this particular slide from. I thought it was quite pertinent for you all to read. Here. So COVID-19 severely worsened indexation challenges this year, in particular for those who are forcibly displaced or stateless, said the United Nations Council on Human Rights. According to the World Bank, it has also created millions of new poor. The World Bank projects that during the course of 2020, between 88 million and 115 million people could fall back into extreme poverty. Between 23 and 35 million people could be forecasted to join them in 2021. Now we're coming to the end of this year, and I would actually encourage anyone that was interested in that particular statistic to review the updated United Nations mid-year report to see what those figures actually turned out to be by June 2021, but I'm pretty sure that the figures are quite similar. Now, marginalization and displacement that can come from marginalization, etc., these can often, they have quite a lasting effect in how policies and people's opportunities are kind of received long term. And so to really exemplify this point, I wanted to show how policy can have an incremental effect in creating marginalization. And so if you just look to this slide here, this is actually from a study from a US university looking at air pollution rates versus inhalations in a New York City. And what they've done here is they've actually quite cleverly segmented the amount of consumption versus emissions. So who is creating air pollution and who's actually inhaling it. So in this image, you can see that in terms of who is emitting the most air pollution, Caucasian communities are the highest. Yet in terms of who deals with the kind of negative consequences, the air pollution and the health risks that come from that, we're seeing that Black and Hispanic communities are disproportionately inhaling the most air pollution. Now, in a case study like America, there's a legacy of bad policies and discriminatory policies that have marginalized segmented communities and groups. There are issues with job generational poverty that is created by government policies that dispossess and discriminate against people of color from getting jobs and entering into the world of work. But we've also noticed that, especially in developed countries, minority groups who typically tend to be in more economically disadvantaged situations were disproportionately affected by COVID in terms of either hospitalizations or mortality rates. And that's not just simply due to factors contributing to factors like financial in opportunity. It's also got to do with things like medical racism, not believing people of color when they tell you that they're sick, a legacy that has been kind of eugenics and eugenicist-based ideologies that have either consciously or subconsciously affected and colored the way that we understand and approach healthcare solutions to different groups and communities. But it's also just another cause for the fact that a lot of our policies aren't really comprehensive in scope, in making sure that marginalised people at risk or at need are getting the right policies and the right legislation that make sure that it creates a level playing field for everyone else. And I think when we look at marginalisation, it's a topic that I think is something that's seriously overlooked over time. When we look at global marginalisation, I mean, we can cite the Sudanese, Egyptian, and Eritrean border dam dispute as a key case study and signpost in how countries typically in the South, considered to be part of the global South, don't really have political power maneuverability in creating their own futures or economic and fiscal opportunities because of the negative connotations or the sustained legacy of marginalization and exclusion that can ensue. So I use the Sudanese border dam dispute as a case study because, facts and figures here, guys, the Eritrean dam was actually funded by predominantly by diasporans, so people that were maybe of Eritrean heritage or had migrated out of Eritrea and were bringing money back into the country. And it was meant to create more kind of sustainable electricity solutions and also help and assist with water. But this dam is also shared and shares a border and territory with Egypt and with Sudan. Now, all of these countries had vested interests in either having a kind of decisive role in deciding how the dam was used to conduct and generate electricity, how the water flow kind of worked, and just in terms of benefits for them economically and fiscally. When Egypt, an ally of the US, sought intervention from America, and Trump famously threatened to withdraw US aid from the Eritreans if they did not concede to the demands of Egypt and cede kind of like, I guess, decisive and overall control of that dam to Egypt, which in actuality makes zero sense because Egypt stands to benefit the least from having control of the dam. But yet, because it's always been a mainstay and standard in international policy that policy conditions are attached to aid or international loans, usually there would be a concession by these groups and communities. The concept of sovereignty only seems to exist in those that have the power and there's decisions to make to decide the world order. It doesn't always seem to work for lesser and smaller countries. And so this was a really powerful first instance illustration of a developing country, in my recent history or knowledge, being able to say, no, we're going to resolve this in the way that we think benefits our people. And that's another example of marginalization within a global context. Obviously, marginalization can exist locally, so it can exist between tribes. And so we see a lot of sectarian conflicts and violence between ethnological groups, ethnic tribes and peoples, nations and polities. Those are quite commonplace. We see it between peoples and nations, again, citing the examples that I've mentioned, but we also see it for policy and political orders. So governments that are created on policies and benchmarks that explicitly discriminate against groups of people, that only maybe protect the interests of those that are ardent supporters or loyal fans. And we've also seen it through, again, like I said, policy, which I've used a case study that we just covered. But another way that we see as a consequence of marginalization is to do with displacement. And I wondered what would happen if we took marginalized people and we actually incorporated them and we incentivized them to be part of a political process. And this ushers in my kind of discussion around pathways to sustainable peace. Now, this is a topic that I admittedly am not well versed in, but I do think it's really, really helpful. And it really helped me contextualize and understand how conflict and war zones and dispossessed people can actually gain a greater voice and influence in the kind of political decision over time. And so here, I really wanted to look at how marginalized groups, especially in the last, I'd say, 5 to 6 years, have really been able to transform entire regions in terms of their policy orders, their political structures and ideologies, and in terms of creating equity and greater parity amongst groups of people. So here, we actually can see how in the last 6 years, grassroots uprisings have challenged the status quo. And I can cite things like the Arab uprising, the Sudanese uprising, the Arab Spring, which is when a number of countries across the Middle East, so Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Sudan, all kind of rose up against the government du jour, the government of the day, to either try and reconstitute, so create a new constitution that was more equitable, or completely disrupted the political order. So whether it was a monarchical, so a monarchy-based system, or a minority government, and created something more democratic. And we've also seen how it completely won favor with a lot of Western countries who argue that democracy is the new rule, the new standard and international convention and law. And we know that this has been a preoccupation of Western powers from as early as the late 80s, early 90s, even 70s, during the Cold War that really started in the 1950s. But we know that, we understand it. If you've learned anything about the Cold War era, that is something that is still kind of going on today, and we're seeing advent of the new Cold War era. And it's often why when we think about international policy or ideological conflicts amongst global polities, you normally see it through the lens of the UK, so the Western allies, versus China and Russia, who have non-democratic systems of governance or democratic systems of governance that are questionable, and how inclusive and how much they uphold the fundamental tenets of democracy and equal voting opportunities for people. I would say rather cynically that I don't even think that in Western countries we're particularly good at exercising a full and extensive measure of democratic freedoms and liberties, but that is a conversation for another day, and maybe I'll redirect you to an op-ed that I'm working on once it's live. But yes, the case study I wanted to use in particular was the Sudanese case study. So to give you a quick overview of Sudan and the story of Sudan, you have Sudan and you have South Sudan. In 2005, South Sudan was created as its own kind of distinct country and nation. And that was because the South Sudan populace was predominantly made up of ethnic African Sudanese people, whilst in Sudan, the kind of ethnic composition of people were largely Arab Africans, so people that had more of an intermix, which is quite common for the Horn of Africa. And so what a lot of Sudanese governments had done is created a kind of caste system, quote unquote, that created and tierized groups of people within Sudanese society based on their proximity to Arabness. So whether you spoke Arabic versus like a local language, whether you looked and appeared more visibly Arab than your African counterparts, and how well you integrated with the tenets of what a Sudanese person looked like. Women were largely dispossessed and excluded from policy considerations. Child marriage was still very much a commonplace in this community, as was FGM. And in the early or mid 2019, we saw a Sudanese uprising that was basically coordinated by a number of Sudanese women. It's incredible. There's some great images and stills that you saw in the presentation of women waving in white, waving a Sudanese flag, which has become the symbol of that revolution. And we saw a lot of sectarian conflict and fighting, or to kind of guarantee a change of the incumbent government and an instatement of an interim government that would ultimately create a new constitution that would have all Sudanese people treated as equals. And I think what was really powerful about this uprising in the Horn of Africa is that the Horn of Africa is contextualized by ethnic conflict, wars, and this ongoing ensuing battle between ethnic Africans, so sub-Saharan Africans, and a mix of Arab Africans. And I think my key takeaways from just in that conflict alone was that Peace can't be guaranteed if all voices aren't included within peace building solutions and strategies. And I guess the cost of war, the cost of civil war in nations is typically internal displacement and the loss of livelihoods, which, as I mentioned, if we go back to that concept of disparateness, breeds insecurity, breeds precariousness. And when you're trying to create and build resilience amongst groups, especially what was noted about the first installation of the Sudanese discussions and peace building discussions under Bashir, there was an invitation for South Sudanese delegation, which is massive because they've never really been included in part of Sudanese society. We saw a unilateral kind of amnesty offered to sectarian fighters and warlords who had often committed some very heinous and egregious crimes against the Sudanese populace, and many other issues that I could list tirelessly about the consequences of this peace building solutions and strategies. But one of the key criticisms of this really kind of monumental and pinnacle peace building discussion was that a large contingent of Sudanese people were excluded from the consultations. And those were displaced, internally displaced and externally displaced Sudanese refugees who had left livelihoods, homes, had spent decades or more than a decade and a half living in refugee shelters, escaping the severe effects of conflict and violence. And I think that we need to, an approach to disrupting the way that we tackle displacement and disparateness is also incorporating these narratives within our peace building solutions. Because I can foresee a scenario where there'll be another uprising and another dispute because we're not successfully incorporating and counting every member of society in our peace building strategies. So again, to exemplify that point, maybe more articulately than I have, I'm going to read you this excerpt from my Instagram. This was in September 2020, so just before the summit last year. Right. The Sudanese and South Sudanese refugee crises have some of the worst recorded displacement figures on the continent, with over 3.2 million internally displaced and a further 1.3 who go on to seek refuge elsewhere. Conflict and ethnic tensions has destroyed the livelihoods and normalcy of many for over a decade. Last year's uprising and transitional government offered some hopes of brokering peace between these two warring nations and within their own respective countries. Sudan's transitional government under Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok received worldwide praise in their efforts to forge peace treaties with the various warlords and mercenaries entangled in these conflicts, offering land remuneration and, for some, autonomous rules of regions. But a large contingent of people have been excluded from the TC consultations, refugees. There has been no similar offerings of land restoration, compensation, or even consultations on whether municipal rule under these warlords is desirable. There has also been no guarantee of justice for survivors of the many war crimes perpetrated by militant groups. Most importantly, there is no guarantee that these communities will not be uprooted in future conflicts. The exclusion of refugee communities poses a huge threat to the permanence of these peace accords. It was popular dissent that ultimately ended dictatorial rule in Sudan. And it is this same common dissent that could ultimately be the transitional government's undoing. And I think there we can kind of leave that point. Now, in terms of trying to reimagine insights from communities, I wanted to talk a bit about a research project that at the time of recording this, I just started doing. It was a collaboration with the UN IOM, and it was investigating African refugee, African migrant precariousness and displacement amidst the ongoing pandemic. And we used the Mediterranean as a case study. So over the course of about 4 to 5 months, I've traveled down 6 Mediterranean countries, living in rural and city communities and interviewing and observing the lives and circumstances of Indigenous African refugee communities, as well as interviewing NGOs and aid organizations that worked with these groups. And so some of the things that I wanted to kind of suggest to you guys today was how we could reimagine inclusive policy formation. So here are some of the things that I came up with. 1, moving beyond paternalism in aid. Now, it's often the case that when the West interacts with developing countries, there's a distinct air of uptighted know-it-allness that characterizes all of these discussions. I know this because I've witnessed it myself, and I definitely think that at the start of my consulting and research experience, I was definitely at risk and guilty of doing this too. We cannot treat people as children, and we cannot treat nations and people as less than or incompetent. We have to understand that there can be a marriage between traditional ways of doing things with Western standards, and that do not have to be diametrically opposed or at odds. We don't have to erase one aspect and facet of an identity in order to accommodate our visions for sustainable peace. It needs to be a marriage between the two. The second thing we need to say, which is slightly controversial and we will not have time to delve into over the course of this session, is I would argue that we reimagine and we reformat the way that we offer aid to developing countries, but I won't get into that too much. I just don't think that it's a sustainable method of creating sustainable and permanent change. Another way that I think we could create more inclusive policy formation is learning from the resilience of displaced, conflict and war-torn communities. There are so many stories of people that kind of reimagine things that are I can't speak English today, an enormous amount of ingenuity and skill. And I think could have been really helpful in helping us kind of tackle what was the most kind of seminal COVID and global pandemic that we'd ever faced in our recent history. For me, it was really useful and helpful to understand and see how African countries responded to COVID prevention and isolation methods versus our Western counterparts. I think that there was much more comprehensive kind of disease and control and prevention in developing countries that were forecasted to have the highest and largest number of mortality rates because of years and decades of outbreaks, of deaths and mass casualties from this. I think they actually had a better strategy than we did in the West. I also think that inclusive policy formation indubitably and invariably involves consultations, so including these groups in conversations and discussions, not just them leading from behind, and also learning from their stories, not just collating them for research methods. So when we learn and ask the community about how did they survive this experience, what did they do differently, let's actually utilize them in much more efficient ways than simply just making a note of them. I'd also argue that we need to establish more permanent representation of lay people in transitional governments. So after the uprising and the civil dispute, what next? What do we do and how do we guarantee more peaceful governments that are representative of different communities and groups? And I guess the last point is more of a kind of a suitable, noteworthy challenge and reminder to the policymakers in the audience. We also need to recognize what a finite world of political stability we live in. 2016, love it or not, discuss it or not, erase it from your minds or accept that it was a very clear and decisive warning for us, was a really, really important time in showing what happens when we presume that the concepts of democracy, of egalitarianism, of meritocracy will be a mainstay in our society. We often exclude voices of dissent, of those that question those ideologies to the edge of political conversations, and in turn, it leads to more reactionary and ironically and arguably more extremist policies and governments that can end up coming and creating really big and worrying kind of outcomes for global communities, marginalized groups. So I think we need to recognize that the tide is shifting. I think 20 of the 10 emerging markets are within emerging economies are within Africa. And so we need to stop looking at developing countries as secondary, as second class, and try to respect them as partners in future projects and collaborations. And this is just some images that I thought were kind of relevant. We see these images often characterizing displacement and refugee communities, often African communities. And I just think it's important that we humanize voices. And now onto the final component of this presentation, because I'm realizing that I've gone on quite a bit. We're going to be talking about Aboriginal Australia and Indigenous people. So this is an elder from Arnhem Land, which is in the south of Australia. And I think this is probably one of the topics that quite a lot of you have come to listen to today. So I think we should, without further ado, let's just get into it. Now, a few statistics that people don't know, or general basic facts that people do not understand or know about concepts of Indigenous people. Well, firstly, Indigenous is often used and touted by right-wing identical groups to kind of argue about why countries should remain ethnically pure and intrinsically theirs. But if you look a bit more into how we use it within policy and within research, Indigenous populaces typically refer to a group of or community of people that have maintained maybe a tribal or a particular identity and kind of livelihood that is very distinct from Western capitalist societies or from most of the societies and communities that we encounter today. So just some general notes that you should know about them. Indigenous communities account for 3% of the global population, yet are the largest single occupiers of the Earth's surface, accounting for about 75% of the Earth's landmass. Indigenous groups are also really well known for their established affinity with the land and natural ecosystems. So a lot of these communities will live off-grid, so out of cities and more in rural communities or in particular terrains. So for example, you have the Inuit tribes of Canada who tend to live more in kind of the cooler and colder climates. You have the Amazonians of the Amazon forest who largely live in there. You've got the Aboriginal communities, some of whom live in cities and some of whom live in the country, in Australia, and so on and so forth. Now, for these Indigenous groups, concepts of stewardship and environmental preservation are taken really seriously in a lot of the Indigenous communities that I've encountered. Often environmental policies and laws around cyclical ecosystems, like environmental preservation and land and sovereignty, are almost written and are law. And as a result of those, a lack of adherence to or disruptive or a lack of regard for those basic fundamental tenets of community or of land actually have very serious consequences for members, participants, and also the wider community. But it's also part of the characterization of Indigenous people that persecution and legal penalties are almost a cornerstone, a central point in their realities. And I guess to exemplify that point, I wanted to take you on a quick timeline of First Nations dispossession in Australia. So a few disclaimers before I share my very, very haphazardly put together timeline of dispossession. It's not in order. As much as there has been legal redress, so efforts to fix the dispossession and exclusion of Indigenous people in Australia, there has also been a lot of seminal, so kind of major policies, maybe first of their kind in some cases, that really set the tone for how Indigenous realities and people are received. And so I wanted to take you through some of the ones that I thought were particularly problematic and needed to be discussed for anyone that's completely oblivious to Aboriginal struggles, especially if prior to arriving in Australia, my only real understanding of Aboriginal people were the people that played the didgeridoo and seeing a lot of surfers, white European surfers on beaches drinking Fosters. Now, Aboriginal othering, persecution, discrimination, dispossession actually is legally enshrined in their constitution. Can you hear the incredulity in my voice? This is an area that I find particularly frustrating. In section 51, subsection 25 of the 1701 Australian Constitution, there is a certain provision in Australia that is called the race powers. And essentially it gives the Australian government unique authority to create discriminatory or separate policies directly for Aboriginal people. Now, that in itself has been a subject of constitutional debate, of legal questioning and queries about whether or not these separate policies that need to be made for Aboriginal people can be inherently discriminatory or positively discriminatory. So are they meant to benefit the Aboriginal people in a good way, or can they be used to unfairly and unjustly mistreat Aboriginal people? Of course, there have been cases and arguments to scrap this provision entirely or to add more legal kind of certainty and clarity around what we mean by creating separate policies for Aboriginal people. But we have not yet come to a point where the government or the Constitution or Supreme Court of Australia are willing to give a concrete position on what the Race Powers Act should include. Now, another real key iteration of Aboriginal dispossession and mistreatment comes in the 1994 government policy called of the stolen generation. Now, this is a policy that existed well before the 1990s, but it had its first kind of comprehensive overview and assessment of how this had affected Aboriginal people during that time. And at the time, there was a figure that 1 in 3 Aboriginal people children had been forcibly removed from their homes, the ones that were white passing or looked less Aboriginal, and were put into white European families and were never told about their Aboriginal identity. The idea was that over time, Aboriginal children would be integrated, ingratiated further within white society, and it would also help decrease the population and foothold of these backless Aboriginal people. Suffice to say, the trauma that Aboriginal and Indigenous people have received and dealt with as a consequence of that has been inordinate. Imagine growing up not having any concept of an identity or an existence that is your own. And I'm sorry, just give me a second. It was one of the most difficult things, speaking plainly and not from I'm trying to teach you something here. When I was in Australia, I had the, I guess, extreme pleasure, but also misfortune of spending a lot of time with Aboriginal and First Nation people. And I met a lovely woman in an Indigenous cultures session at the University of Sydney who had actually grown up with a white mother and an Aboriginal father, a father who did not even know that he was Aboriginal. And he grew up in a society where he was a bit darker skinned than his peers and was subject to a lot of abuse and discrimination, but never really understood why he was mistreated until I think it was about a year or two before he passed away, and he realized that actually he was Aboriginal. And the trauma in a community that is so heavily, an identity and a tribal people that are so heavily community-based, whose concepts and knowledge of self, of common language, of affinities with the land and environment are so central to the way that they navigate the world and their polities, is one that is enormously traumatic. Think about growing up as an adopted child, having no real concept of family, being mistreated and othered by your society and community, only to find out that actually you belong to a really amazing family and culture that would love you and ingratiate you completely, but were never given the opportunity to do so. And that's a really extreme example of adoptions. In most cases, adoptions are really positive stories and are done because of sad circumstances and people not being able to provide for their children. But in this case, this was a decisive government policy that was used to disincentivize, to other, and to demoralize a lot of Aboriginal communities. And the consequences of how Aboriginal people have dealt with forced government-sanctioned erasure it's very harrowing. In a lot of cases, people live in extreme poverty, are alcohol and drug dependent, are in really poor and ill health, and are really remote, isolated, and have a lot of mental health issues that come and are born from that trauma of knowing that the country, the nations that once were forged and created a really incredible ecosystem are now entirely erased, and you're forced into a system that will never truly accept you as one of theirs. And as a consequence of that, Aboriginal people have responded to these discriminations. One was a Enough is Enough speech that was led by an Aboriginal tribal council, and it was delivered at in response to the 1975 UN Human Rights Act, and has not been enshrined in Australian domestic law, by the way, terrible. And it was basically arguing that and was calling for an end to the discrimination, human rights abuses and violations of Aboriginal and First Nation people. We have a number of different case studies and samples cited as why there should be better treatment. And the second key speech policy objective that I think is worth noting here is the Uluru Statement of Heart. Now, if you know anything about Uluru, there was a lot of controversy last summer about this massive piece of red red, I'm trying to think of the right word, red rock, red interface, red rock, apologies, that's not the most accurate term for it, but it has an enormous amount. It's become a really big tourist attraction. People go and scale it. But Aboriginal people have actually noted that it has a lot of significance for them, not only from like a cultural perspective, but also from an identity and history perspective. And so the government have passed a law banning people from kind of climbing up it, defacing it. But it still is, that's where this council basically kind of communed, because it's a really key central point of Australia, and it's really key in Aboriginal identities that span beyond tribes and different nations. And it basically calls for constitutional redress, a change in the constitution and a change in the ways that Aboriginal people interact in global policy that hasn't been passed or considered freely beyond lip service from the government yet. But I wanted to show that, to juxtapose these two instances of dispossession with an attempt by Aboriginal people to self-lead, to self-redress, and to gain greater freedoms. Now, one of the arguably, in my opinion, worst bits of legislation that's been passed in recent history was the Stronger Futures legislation bill. Now, what this bill was the intention of this bill was to create and to tackle the health issues, the alcohol and drug abuse that was quite prevalent in central and northern Australian territories, which is disproportionately overrepresented by Aboriginal people. But what this bill ultimately ended up doing was creating a number of restrictions and impositions on Aboriginal people that I think, were Australia to have a human rights constitution or framework, would be a massive contravention of their basic rights and liberties. So it was policies like having special permits to leave certain regions or towns, not being allowed to drink alcohol, having a night curfew before curfews became the norm in lockdown, not being allowed to read or process certain content or materials, and really just stripping Aboriginal people of their fundamental rights to agency, so to decide for their futures and their lives for themselves, while also coming from a really patronising paternalistic policy that it's meant to be for the greater good. And this bill is still in law. It's not been stricken. I think it was revised in 2016, but as far as I'm aware, it has not been struck. But even if it has, it's a really clear illustration of how far the Australian government are willing to go in creating this tiered citizenship and an equal rights and opportunity for Aboriginal people. So one thing I wanted to do now is just kind of talk and signpost something that I've been working on that I kind of was based off my interactions and experiences with Australians, Aboriginal people, First Nation people, Torres Strait Islanders, other Aboriginal tribes and First Nation tribes that exist in Australia. And it was basically trying to use oral knowledge, so yarning, which is a form of Aboriginal oral knowledge, which is about speaking in circles and round tables and discussing parts and instances of history, in revolutionising, disrupting the way that Australia dealt with its environmental policy. And this seemed like a particularly timely paper in light of the bushfires, which, as you know from the introductory video, was one of the worst in recent history. Now, the first thing I thought was really important was framing ideas or creating policies that were informed by ideas of country. And then country is what Aboriginal people refer to as land and ecosystems. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the points I've made here, because the last video that you'll be watching before we get into the Q&A session actually really extensively kind of covers this issue, and it's from an Aboriginal and Indigenous elder. And I think it's really important that I don't speak on behalf of people, especially Aboriginal people, when it comes to these concepts. But that's something I thought was really important. The second thing that I thought we could do to reimagine environmental policy was to create an Indigenous consultative body that they used to have in Australia. It's a much more comprehensive piece that I'm working on at the moment, and I will signpost to you, like I said at the end, that is in line with the UN Convention on the International Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People or First Nation people, and it talks about creating a consultative and consultative body that allows Aboriginal people and Indigenous people to have a decisive say in policies that affect them. Doesn't seem so revolutionary, does it? The third thing I argued, and I mentioned it before, was adopting non-Western approaches to research. When we often interact with communities, especially when we try to inform policies based on case studies, we often tend to use very Western vernaculars and Western research methods in how we approach these groups. And so one thing I thought would be really helpful was using yarning, like I told you, as a form of oral knowledge sharing amongst elders with their community, as a means of understanding the ecosystems and promoting cyclical change within the Australian environment. And cyclical use, but we will get into that again. And the last thing I wanted, and I thought was really important in creating a new healthy and permanent environmental policy in Australia, was preserving Indigenous cultures, culture ways in settler and colonial and post-colonial communities that exist in Australia, more kind of vividly in Australia. It's still something that is grappled with in Africa, and I cannot wait to talk to you guys a bit more about the research that I'm doing at the moment to really kind of understand African Indigenous realities. But those are my main contributions, and what I want to do now actually is go back and show you this video that I think is really, really helpful and is the perfect summary for my main discussion. And I will give you some closing notes and we'll get into the Q&A portion of this presentation very shortly.
When I was young, we were told that there was a one-eyed rainbow serpent, Wanambi Kurugutu, living here in Ulumbaro. He was powerful. He is the creator of all these lands. I share the story because it's close to me. There's other rainbow serpents all around, but this story is told only here in Papanya, and it's our story, Lurja people's story. In the old days, we were told that one-eyed rainbow serpent had always lived here and always protected this place. He gave us the water, he gave us life, he gave us everything that we needed. And when other rainbow serpents came, he always fought them and he always won. He was all powerful. When we saw that there was lightning, we knew that the one-eyed rain serpent was fighting. He had one eye that shined bright like a light. When we was told not to go to his resting place, we knew that was him saying not to trespass. When we call out to country, we're calling out to all country, so the country knows that we're approaching and the country lets us know that we are welcome. Today, we feel sad because the rainbow serpent is no longer here. When rain comes, we see that there is no longer any lightning. Some people say that he was taken or stolen from this country. The people of this community and this land, the Lurja people, we feel that because he is not here, that the land has changed. When the one-eyed rain serpent was around, there was water flowing in every direction. We have a dam here and was always full of water. Today, there's no longer any water and it makes us cry. It's really making me sad because a long time ago, as kids, we used to swim here. Oh, this here used to be full of water. This rock here, when you jump into the water, you can't see any flowing water now because the one-eyed rain serpent is no longer here. That's why there's no life, there's no water, everything's dead. When we found out that he was taken, we also was told from the clever man not to worry because there is a baby one-eyed rain serpent and that was his child. We know that it's only young and it's weak. We have rangers working in local community, Papanya. We work as community members, family, friends, to clean old water places, and that will make the baby one-eyed rainbow serpent stronger. You see the beautiful country as Anangoloriji Tindupi people. We've always seen how beautiful it is, and that's why we want to protect and take care of this land. We would like to ask that you protect and look after this country. We're helping ourselves and we're helping the country. When we help the country helps us.
Great. So that's the kind of, I guess, the final installment of the presentation for you guys. I thought it was a better way to end on it. And I've realized that unfortunately I don't have the kind of recording of the Aboriginal elders I was thinking of in particular, who gives a really great overview of country. What I can do for you guys is if you are watching and accessing this recording on my YouTube channel or on the actual web platform for the summit, I will list at the bottom, and I will send over to Alicia, all of the kind of things that I reference here, any policies that might be of interest to you, any articles and any videos that might be better explaining certain concepts to you. I was very conscious of the fact that, you know, the audience, you guys are not all kind of well versed in this topic. It's often for you guys, like I said, the first time many of you are hearing about this topic. And so I wanted to be really sure that the language that I used throughout this session and this note address was really accessible. So hopefully I've done a good enough job at making that possible for you all. I guess the closing statement, what would I say is really useful for you guys to understand? Well, I think at the heart of everything that I talked about here today, it's that we live in a world where if you are not visible online, you automatically become invisible. When we think about Indigenous tribes, displaced people, disparate groups, we often trivialize them through the lens of our basic limited understanding of things. And it's one of the things that I feel very strongly about disrupting and changing with Walinda Lingo, my consultancy, with my own work and research contributions. And it's what I'm really happy to see so many more of you getting involved in. When we talk about Black Lives Matter as a concept, as a system of inequity and about police brutality, we often talk through the lens of just the Black American issue. But what was really powerful about kind of disrupting that approach is just only seeing it as a singular issue, is that there was a similar Black Lives Matter movement in Australia, but it was all around Indigenous mass incarceration and abuses. There have been similar talks and instances of brutality in the Philippines, under Duterte's government. And most recently in October, at the end of the summit, we saw the End SARS movement in Nigeria, which was where a group of women and also young people coalesced around the consistent and sustained brutality by End SARS, the special anti-robbery unit or squad in Nigeria, abusing their power to mistreat people and to assault women. And it's just now a powerful illustration of what happens when we don't approach and experience communities through a single lens and perspective. And it's something that I hope that by watching and engaging with this address today, you've started to think about ways that you can change things. The solutions that I've offered here are not perfect. I know that there definitely are, for me, quite difficult topics to often unpack within my own research, my own work. And it's why I don't only think that I have an obligation or duty to speak at conferences like this, and I'm very grateful that I had the opportunity to deliver this address, but I also think it's really important to share these findings and learnings in research, in papers, and in other visual and audible ways that reflect and pay homage to the communities that we're learning from. And so over the next 18 to 20 months, so by about the end of 2022, there will be a series of papers, researches, journals, conferences, talks and learnings that you will all be able to have access to that really delve into the topics that I've covered here today in much more detail and granularity, some with a lot more specialist terminology and some that are a lot more accessible in language. But I think those are all really important things that we can be doing to learn more about these communities. And now, without further ado, I just want to say thank you so much for sticking with me. For those of you that are interested in the next component of this presentation, it's going to be a quick Q&A session for about 10 to 15 minutes, answering any questions people have about entering into policy, into the topics that were addressed over the course of this conference, and probably will be a separate video on the YouTube channel. So if you are tired of listening to me speak, now might be the time for you to stop